The winter wind howling off the Delaware River carried a bitter, freezing sting, rattling the frozen branches of the ancient oak trees that lined the suburban streets of Philadelphia. Tucked away at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac stood a charming, red-brick colonial house, a home that for 30 years had been a sanctuary of warmth, laughter, and family holidays. Inside, the living room was illuminated only by the amber glow of a crackling fireplace and the soft, blinking lights of a modest New Year's Eve tree. Sitting in his favorite worn leather armchair by the frosted window was Garrett Miller. At 66, the retired veteran homicide detective still carried the imposing, stone-faced discipline of a man who had spent his life staring into the darkest corners of human nature. His silver hair was cropped neat, his broad shoulders were slightly slouched but unbowed by age, and his deep-set gray eyes held a sharp, unblinking focus that missed nothing. Garrett was staring at a framed photograph resting on the mantelpiece, a picture of his late wife, Eleanor, smiling against a backdrop of spring bluebells. Eleanor had passed away 2 years ago, leaving a gaping, agonizing void in the historic house. She had left behind her most cherished asset, the absolute title deed to this valuable property and a substantial, multi-million-dollar inheritance fund intended to secure Garrett's retirement. Garrett lived a quiet, modest life, preferring to spend his days fixing the antique plumbing, tending to Eleanor's indoor garden, and cooking simple, traditional meals. He was a man who chose silence over conflict, a trait that his family had dangerously mistaken for physical and mental fragility. The heavy silence of the house was broken by the sound of tires crunching over the frozen gravel driveway outside. Through the frosted glass, Garrett watched a flashy, brand-new sports utility vehicle park right beneath the porch light. He didn't move. He didn't rise to greet them. Instead, his breathing slowed into the familiar, calculated cadence he used to employ when waiting in an interrogation room. The heavy oak front door burst open, letting in a swirl of freezing winter air along with 2 figures wrapped in expensive, designer wool coats. "Step forward, Amber," Garrett's 24-year-old youngest daughter. Amber had always been the golden child, fiercely protected and spoiled by her mother, but the fast-paced, material-driven lifestyle of downtown Philadelphia had eroded her conscience. She moved with an anxious, superficial energy, her eyes immediately scanning the antique furniture and the heavy silver candlesticks on the dining table, rather than looking at her father. Beside her was her husband of 2 years, Wesley, a slick, fast-talking junior investment broker whose entire existence was fueled by credit card debt and a desperate desire to project an aura of extreme wealth to his corporate peers. "Dad," Amber called out, her voice carrying a high-pitched, synthetic warmth that sounded entirely practiced. She rushed into the living room, dropping her designer leather bags onto the hardwood floor, and threw her arms around Garrett's neck. "Oh, Dad, it's so freezing outside." "We felt so incredibly guilty thinking about you sitting here all alone in this massive house on New Year's Eve. We packed our bags and decided to come home for the weekend to take care of you. We're going to make this the best holiday ever." Wesley stepped up behind her, extending a hand that was weighed down by a massive, gold luxury watch. "Good to see you, Chief," Wesley said, using a hollow nickname that made Garrett's jaw tighten imperceptibly. "You're looking a bit tired, Garrett." "This old house is a lot of maintenance for a man of your age. Amber and I were talking on the drive down. We really think it's time we stepped in to help you manage the logistics of the estate. You shouldn't be carrying this burden alone." Garrett slowly stood up from his leather chair, his towering frame casting a long, commanding shadow across the brick fireplace. He accepted his daughter's embrace, but his arms remained slack, his eyes tracking the nervous twitch in Wesley's left hand, a classic physical tell of a man carrying a massive financial deception. "An unannounced visit on the final night of the year," Garrett said, his deep, rumbling baritone completely steady, devoid of any immediate emotion, "and a sudden concern for my domestic maintenance. It is fascinating how heavy the burden of this house becomes right when the municipal property tax assessments are published." Amber's synthetic smile faltered for a fraction of a second, an instinctive flash of crossing her features before she quickly smoothed it over with a high-pitched laugh. "Oh, Dad, don't be like that. I'm your daughter. I just want to cook you a warm dinner, sit by the fire, and help you sort through Mom's old files in the study. You know how much she loved organization." "Of course," Garrett replied smoothly, his gray eyes locking onto Wesley, who was already casually pacing toward the hallway that led to the private master suite upstairs. "Unpack your things in the guest quarters. I'll go down to the kitchen and start prepping the New Year's Eve roast. Let's see exactly how much family solidarity we can harvest tonight. As Amber and Wesley turned toward the staircase, their whispered, frantic arguments about bank account routing numbers, immediate liquidation parameters, and outstanding high-interest bridge loans drifting back down the wooden steps, Garrett didn't panic. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his heavy wool cardigan, his fingers lightly brushing the smooth casing of his smartphone. Before their vehicle had even entered the cul-de-sac, Garrett had activated a secure, military-grade digital audio monitoring network he had discreetly integrated into the house's old intercom system weeks ago. Every whisper, every deceptive plan, and every arrogant insult they uttered under his roof was currently being logged in crystal-clear quality, transmitting directly to a secure cloud server managed by his former partner at the Philadelphia Police Department. Garrett walked toward the kitchen, a cold, predatory calm settling over his mind. His youngest daughter and her parasitic husband hadn't come to keep an old gagoaful widower company. They had come to execute a financial execution, believing a retired detective would be too blind and broken by grief to notice the knife until it was already in his back. Garrett turned on the kitchen lights, his face hardening into an unyielding mask of stone. The perimeter was set, the elements of their greed were fully recorded, and Garrett Miller was about to deliver a final, devastating lesson in criminal investigation. Rõ ràng rồi, mỗi chương tiếp theo sẽ được kiểm soát chặt chẽ ở mức khoảng 700 từ để mạch truyện cô đọng, dồn dập và đúng nhịp độ. Dưới đây là Chapter 2 của kịch bản Philadelphia. Chapter 2, The Midnight Blueprint. The kitchen clock ticked down toward 10:00 p.m., its steady, rhythmic sound filled with an eerie tension. Garrett stood by the copper sink, slowly cutting the New Year's Eve roast with a heavy carving knife. His movements were slow, fluid, and completely calculated. Upstairs, the faint creak of the old floorboards told him exactly where his guests were. They weren't unpacking. They were searching his private study. 25 years in the Philadelphia Police Department's Homicide Division had taught Garrett that criminals always become incredibly sloppy when they think their victim is weak. Amber and Wesley viewed him as an isolated, grieving old man who spent his days staring at old photographs. They didn't know that Garrett's mind was still the same steel trap that had locked away dozens of the city's most ruthless operators. 10 minutes later, Amber and Wesley walked down the stairs, their faces flushed with a nervous, triumphant energy. Wesley had tucked a thin, white envelope into his jacket pocket. "Dinner smells amazing, Dad," Amber said, her voice shaking slightly as she set 3 plates on the wooden dining table. "You really shouldn't work so hard. Wesley and I can handle the cleanup later." "It's no trouble," Garrett murmured, keeping his voice flat and tired. He sat down at the head of the table, serving the meat in silence. Wesley leaned forward, tapping his fingers against his expensive gold watch. "Garrett, I was looking through some old financial journals in your study earlier. Just looking for a pen, actually. I noticed that Eleanor's primary estate accounts and the title deed to this house are still registered under an outdated family trust format. In the investment world, that's a massive liability. If the market shifts next week, the state could freeze your assets." "Is that so?" Garrett asked, taking a slow sip of his water. He let his gaze wander unfocused across the room, perfectly feigning the slight confusion of an aging man. "Absolutely," Wesley pressed on, his eyes gleaming with greed. "Amber and I have a close friend at a corporate wealth firm downtown. If you sign an emergency management waiver tonight, we can legally move your entire $2.5 million portfolio into a high-yield corporate account under Amber's name. It completely bypasses the municipal tax block." Amber reached across the table, squeezing Garrett's calloused hand. Her palms were damp with sweat. "Please, Dad, we are just doing this out of pure, deep filial concern. Mom would want us to protect what she left behind. Just sign the transition papers before the new year begins." Garrett looked down at his plate. His private investigator, Carla Summers, had already sent him a complete forensic breakdown of Wesley's financial status yesterday morning. Wesley wasn't a successful broker. He was $47,000 in high-interest debt, facing immediate eviction from his luxury downtown apartment, and had spent the last month dodging corporate fraud investigators. This midnight intervention wasn't financial advice. It was a desperate, armed robbery without a gun. "The papers," Garrett murmured, letting his voice trail off weakly. I suppose. Everything is getting so complicated these days. The numbers blur together. Exactly, Chief. Let us handle the heavy lifting, Wesley said, a predatory smile spreading across his face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick, legal document, sliding it over the mahogany wood along with a heavy designer pen. It wasn't a wealth management waiver. It was an absolute, unconditional power of attorney and property transfer form. If Garrett signed it, he would be legally homeless and bankrupt by sunrise. I need to check the heating unit in the basement first, Garrett said, slowly pushing his chair back and standing up with a heavy sigh. The pipes rumble when the temperature drops below freezing. Let me handle that, and then we will look at your papers. Take your time, Dad, Amber said quickly, her face lighting up with a sickening sense of victory. We'll be right here waiting. Garrett walked down the narrow wooden stairs into the pitch-black basement. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, the tired slump in his shoulders vanished. He pulled his smartphone from his cardigan vest, opening the secure audio monitoring application. The microphone hidden inside the living room's antique grandfather clock was broadcasting their conversation with perfect clarity. Through the speaker, Wesley's arrogant laughter echoed in the dark basement. The old bastard is completely out of it. He's going to sign the whole estate over without even reading the first page. Text the developers right now. Tell them we have the deed secured. We pay off our credit cards by Tuesday and leave this garbage suburb behind. Garrett closed the app, his gray eyes turning into 2 blocks of polished ice. They had signed their own destruction under his roof. He bypassed the heating unit, walked over to a secure metal locker hidden behind the concrete foundation wall, and punched in a 7-digit code. The locker clicked open, revealing a thick leather folder containing his pristine medical clearances, financial audit trails, and a direct radio link to the local precinct. The trap was fully set. The basement was freezing, but Garrett's blood ran hot with a steady, clinical rage. He opened the thick leather folder inside the hidden locker, checking the pristine documentation one last time. It contained a comprehensive cognitive assessment certified by the state's top forensic psychiatrist just 48 hours ago, proving his mental acuity was flawless. Beneath it lay the financial audit records gathered by Carla Summers, detailing Amber and Wesley's crushing debts. He slid the files into a manila envelope, picked up his vintage police-issue tactical radio, and switched it to an encrypted tactical channel. Station 1, this is Miller, Garrett said, his voice a low, harsh whisper in the darkness. Go ahead, Captain, a crisp voice crackled back instantly. It was Lieutenant Marcus Vance, Garrett's former junior detective, now commanding the local precinct. The targets have attempted to execute the fraudulent asset transfer. I have the digital audio recordings of their conspiracy saved to the cloud. They are expecting me to sign a forged power of attorney within the hour. Deploy the perimeter units to the cul-de-sac. Keep the lights off until I signal. Copy that, Captain. Units are rolling. We'll be in position in 5 minutes. Garrett clipped the radio to his belt, pulled his heavy cardigan tight, and walked back up the wooden basement stairs. He deliberately slowed his pace as he approached the kitchen door, slouching his shoulders and letting his left foot drag slightly against the hardwood floor to maintain the illusion of a frail, fading old man. When he stepped back into the dining room, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Amber was pacing near the fireplace, her fingers frantically twisting her diamond ring. Wesley was sitting at the table, staring intensely at his smartphone, a thick sweat breaking out along his hairline. The legal document and the silver designer pen remained placed under the amber light, waiting like a coiled snake. Everything is fine with the pipes, Garrett mumbled, rubbing his temples as if fighting off a massive wave of exhaustion. He slowly shuffled back to the head of the table and sank heavily into his chair. He let his eyes glaze over as he stared at the paper. Now, what was it you needed me to look at, Wesley? My head. It feels incredibly heavy tonight. Wesley's eyes lit up with a predatory, manic excitement. He instantly slid the paper another inch closer to Garrett's hand, unscrewing the cap of the pen with a practiced click. It's just the wealth management waiver, Garrett. Don't stress your head about the details. We just need your signature right here at the bottom of page 14 to keep the bank from freezing Eleanor's retirement fund. Just sign it, and you can go straight to bed. Amber will bring you some warm tea. Amber stepped behind Garrett's chair, her hands coming down to rest heavily on his shoulders. Her grip was tight, trembling with a volatile mix of panic and greed. Just do it for us, Dad, she whispered in his ear, her voice dripping with artificial affection. We want to take care of you. We want to protect Mom's legacy before the new year starts. Trust us. Garrett picked up the silver pen. He held it bare millimeters above the signature line, watching his daughter's reflection in the dark glass of the window. He could see the triumphant, arrogant smirk spreading across Wesley's face, the look of a thief who believed he had successfully executed the perfect, bloodless robbery of an old man's life. The grandfather clock in the living room began its deep, resonant chime, striking the first note of midnight. The new year had officially arrived. Garrett set the pen down flat on the mahogany wood. He stood up from his chair. The simulated tremor in his hands vanished instantly. His spine snapped straight, his chest expanding as his posture returned to the commanding, intimidating alignment of a seasoned homicide captain. The glazed, vacant look in his gray eyes evaporated, replaced by a freezing, lethal clarity that made Wesley instantly freeze in his seat. The clock has struck 12, Wesley, Garrett said, his voice dropping into a booming, iron-hard baritone that completely shattered the quiet of the room. And your 90-day deadline with the Vanguard developers has just run out. Sit down and keep your hands on the table. Wesley's face transformed from an arrogant smirk into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. He tried to laugh. The sound caught in his throat as he looked up into the piercing, granite-hard stare of his father-in-law. Dad, what are you talking about? Amber stammered, her hands flying off Garrett's shoulders as she took a frantic step backward. You're not making any sense. The medication, you must be having a spell. The only spell I am under, Amber, is the profound disappointment of watching my own daughter turn into a common thief, Garrett said smoothly, stepping around the table with a slow, deliberate stride. He reached into his cardigan and pulled out the manila envelope, tossing it flat onto the dinner table right over the unsigned contracts. The heavy thud of the paper sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Open it, Wesley, Garrett commanded. With trembling fingers, Wesley opened the clasp and pulled out the contents. His eyes widened in absolute horror as he scanned the first document, a certified forensic neurological clearance stamped by the chief psychiatrist of Pennsylvania. This is impossible, Wesley whispered, his voice cracking as the sweat began to pour down his cheeks. You've been low for weeks. You forgot where you put your car keys yesterday. I placed my keys in the hallway drawer, Wesley, right where they belonged. I simply wanted to see if you would look for them in my safe instead, Garrett replied, his voice dropping into a dangerous, clinical octave. I am a retired homicide captain. I spent 25 years reading the body language of liars, killers, and frauds. Did you honestly believe a slick, low-level investment broker and a spoiled girl could walk into my house and outmaneuver me? Before Amber could forge an excuse, Garrett tapped the glass screen of his smartphone resting on the table. He pressed the playback button on his secure audio application. The dining room was instantly filled with the crystal-clear recording from the basement wiretap. Wesley's own arrogant voice boomed through the speakers. The old bastard is completely out of it. Text the developers right now. Tell them we have the deed secured. We pay off our credit cards by Tuesday. Amber froze, her face draining of all color until she looked like a ghost under her dining lights. Dad, please, she sobbed, dropping to her knees on the hardwood floor. We were desperate. Wesley's firm, they're investigating him for corporate fraud. We owe $47,000. The landlord is evicting us next week. They were going to ruin us. So you decided to ruin me instead, Garrett said, looking down at his daughter with an expression of freezing, heavy sorrow. You decided to forge a power of attorney to dump your mother's legacy into the hands of predatory developers. Wesley's survival instincts finally kicked in. He grabbed his designer coat from the chair, reaching frantically for his car keys. This is a civil matter. You have a hidden microphone, which is illegal wiretapping in this state. You can't prove a damn thing in court, Garrett. We're leaving. It's only illegal if both parties have an expectation of privacy, Wesley, Garrett said, a cold, predatory smile breaking across his face. But when you are planning a Class 3 felony to exploit an at-risk elderly adult on a property protected by a judicial security warrant, the rules change drastically. And as for leaving, Garrett reached over to the wall console and flipped a heavy industrial breaker switch. Instantly, the massive, high-powered security floodlights mounted along the brick exterior of the house flared to life, casting blinding white beams through the dining room windows. The illumination completely pierced the darkness of the suburban cul-de-sac. Standing directly outside the front porch, their red and blue tactical lights flashing violently against the falling snow, were four marked cruisers from the Philadelphia Police Department. A dozen armed officers, led by Lieutenant Marcus Vance, were already marching up the concrete steps, their heavy boots thudding against the wood. The heavy front door was kicked open with a thunderous bang, and the freezing winter air swirled into the house as the police force flooded the living room, their weapons drawn and handcuffs glinting under the lights. "The tactical perimeter is locked down," Wesley Garrett whispered, his jaw setting like case-hardened iron as his old junior detective stepped forward to read them their rights. "The new year has begun, and your time under my roof is officially expired." The chaotic flashing of police lights eventually faded from the frosted windows, leaving the colonial house in a deep, heavy silence. While Amber and Wesley were transported to the county holding facility, the physical battleground shifted entirely into a meticulous legal cleanup. Garrett sat at his mahogany dining table, the remains of the untouched New Year's Eve dinner cleared away, replaced by stacks of certified banking logs and court affidavits. Marcus Reynolds, Garrett's longtime family attorney, arrived at the house just as the sun began to peek over the icy Delaware River. He dropped a heavy briefcase onto the table, his face tight with professional focus. "They are completely trapped, Garrett," Marcus said, snapping the locks open. "The digital audio files you captured match the forensic banking trails Carla Summers pulled from downtown. Wesley didn't just borrow money from the Vanguard Group. He actively used your late wife's identity and forged signatures to secure a $20,000 cash advance to stall his corporate debts. That elevates this from a domestic dispute to aggravated identity theft and grand larceny." Garrett rubbed his tired eyes, staring at a bank statement highlighting Wesley's maxed-out credit cards and a 2-month eviction notice on their South Beach apartment. "I spent my entire career locking up predators, Marcus. I just never expected to find one carrying my own blood." Amber's defense team is already trying to file an emergency bail application, claiming she was a victim of Wesley's emotional coercion, Marcus explained, sliding a document over. "But the wiretap audio completely demolishes that strategy. She wasn't coerced. She was actively pushing the pen into your hand while whispering lies about your health." The realization of his daughter's deep, cold calculations hit Garrett like a physical blow, but his detective instincts immediately overridden the grief. In the eyes of the law, an unexecuted contract was only the beginning. To ensure they could never threaten his sanctuary or Eleanor's legacy again, he needed to launch a devastating counteroffensive before the corporate developers at Vanguard could deploy their own high-priced litigators to bury the fraud. By noon, Garrett and Marcus had officially filed a massive civil conspiracy counter-petition within the Pennsylvania Circuit Court. They weren't just defending the estate, they were seeking a total freeze on Wesley's professional brokerage licenses, an immediate freeze on all joint assets, and a permanent injunction that would strip Amber of any future claims to the Miller family trust. The paper trail was airtight, the evidence was absolute, and as Garrett signed his name to the formal criminal complaint, he knew the crumbling facade of his daughter's luxury lifestyle was about to be pulverized under the full weight of the justice system. The digital footprint left behind by Amber and Wesley was a messy trail of desperate financial crimes. While the couple remained held in county custody without bail due to the severity of the elderly exploitation charges, Carla Summers uncovered the final link connecting them to a larger predatory network. Garrett sat in his study, the room chilly despite the fire. Carla's voice came through his secure phone line, rapid and precise. "Captain, we just pulled the messaging logs between Wesley and a senior acquisition agent at the Vanguard Group. This wasn't a standard land buyout. Vanguard actively targeted your neighborhood for commercial rezoning. They knew your property was the crown jewel of the cul-de-sac. And they used my son-in-law to get to it," Garrett said, his voice flat. "Exactly. Wesley owed $47,000 to an underground sports betting operation in downtown Philly. Vanguard found out, bought his debt from the bookies, and used it as leverage. They told Wesley that if he couldn't deliver your signed deed by New Year's Day, They would pass his fraudulent corporate banking records directly to the federal prosecutors. Garrett leaned back, his gray eyes locking onto the photograph of Eleanor. The corporate predators had found a weak link in his family hull and twisted it until it snapped. Wesley and Amber weren't just greedy. They were cowards who chose to poison a father's life rather than face the consequences of their own reckless actions. They thought an old detective would be easy prey, Garrett murmured. They forgot that a cornered officer knows exactly how to trace the chain back to the handler. The district attorney just reviewed our wiretap audio and Dr. Chen's medical report, Carla added. They are upgrading the charges to racketeering and grand larceny. Vanguard's agent is being picked up by federal warrants as we speak. The chain is completely shattered. Garrett thanked Carla and hung up. He walked down to the living room, picking up the unsigned property transfer documents still resting on the table. In less than 24 hours, the legal counteroffensive had completely neutralized the corporate threat. The Vanguard Group was facing a massive state investigation. Wesley's brokerage license was permanently revoked, and Amber was facing a definitive prison sentence. He threw the fraudulent contracts into the center of the fireplace, watching the white paper curl and turn to black ash under the heat of the flames. The emotional wound of his daughter's betrayal would take years to heal, but the structural integrity of his home and his late wife's legacy remained absolute, unyielding, and entirely protected. The marble pillars of the Philadelphia criminal courthouse stood imposing against the gray winter sky. Inside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere was thick with the cold reality of a federal prosecution. Garrett sat quietly at the prosecutor's table, his hands folded over a leather portfolio. Beside him, Marcus Reynolds was sorting through a stack of newly certified state documents. Across the aisle sat Amber and Wesley. Stripped of their expensive designer wool coats and luxury watches, they looked broken. Wesley's expensive hair was messy, his eyes darting nervously toward the gallery, while Amber sat with her head down, her shoulders shaking with silent, desperate tears. Their newly appointed public defender sat beside them, looking over the massive state evidence file with grim resignation. Judge Catherine Holloway adjusted her glasses and looked down at the bench. We are here to hear the matter of the Commonwealth versus Wesley Kelly and Amber Miller Kelly on charges of felony elder exploitation, grand larceny, and identity fraud. Mr. Reynolds, you have submitted a supplemental forensic package. Present your core evidence. Marcus Reynolds stood up, buttoning his jacket. Thank you, Your Honor. We have submitted 3 pieces of irrefutable data. First, a comprehensive neurological clearance from the Pennsylvania Psychiatric Institute, proving Captain Garrett Miller's cognitive faculties are in the 98th percentile. He possesses 0 impairment. The public defender side, leaning back. The medical defense they hoped to use to claim familial confusion was completely dead. Second, Marcus continued, his voice ringing through the silent courtroom. We have submitted the authenticated cloud recordings from the night of December 31st. The audio captures both defendants explicitly planning to drug Captain Miller with pharmaceutical sedatives, forge his signature on a power of attorney document, and immediately liquidate this historic family estate to clear their personal credit card debts. Amber let out a sharp, choked sob, covering her face with her hands. Your Honor, the public defender said, standing up weakly, my clients are young and were under extreme, predatory financial pressure from corporate entities. They have no prior criminal record. We ask the court to consider a deferred sentence with intensive probation and mandatory financial restitution. Restitution with what money, counselor? Judge Holloway cut in, her voice dripping with ice. The forensic audit shows your clients are completely bankrupt, facing eviction, and actively engaged in a premeditated conspiracy to commit identity theft against a decorated veteran. This wasn't a mistake born out of pressure. This was a calculated, heartless execution of a father's life. Judge Holloway looked at Garrett, her eyes softening for a brief fraction of a second before turning back into flint. Captain Miller, before this court passes a definitive ruling on the criminal protective orders and sets the trial date, do you wish to make a victim impact statement? Garrett slowly stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the oak flooring. He didn't look at Wesley. He kept his gray eyes locked directly onto his youngest daughter until she was forced to look up and meet his gaze. I spent 25 years protecting this city from monsters, Amber, Garrett said, his deep baritone completely steady, devoid of any anger, carrying only a crushing, absolute finality. I built a home with your mother to protect you. I would have given you my last dollar if you had simply walked into my kitchen and asked for help. But you chose to walk in my house as a predator. You chose to try and steal the legacy your mother died to preserve. You chose a thief's path, and now you will walk it to the very end. Judge Holloway did not hesitate. Her gavel came down with a sharp, echoing crack that sealed the fate of the two defendants. The court finds the evidence of premeditated elder exploitation, identity fraud, and grand larceny to be absolute, Judge Holloway declared, her eyes burning with authority. The defendants will remain remanded in custody without bail pending their formal sentencing hearing. Furthermore, I am issuing a permanent, non-expiring criminal protective order. Amber Miller Kelly and Wesley Kelly are barred from ever contacting Captain Garrett Miller or approaching his property within a radius of 100 miles. This court is adjourned. The bailiffs stepped forward instantly, clicking heavy steel handcuffs around Wesley and Amber's wrists. Wesley looked completely hollow, his head hanging low as his knees buckled to the weight of his absolute ruin. Amber turned back toward her father one last time, her eyes pleading through a mask of running mascara. But Garrett did not look back. He stood tall, his eyes fixed forward as they were led through the side doors and into the cell blocks below. 2 weeks later, the legal demolition was finalized. Facing the mountain of wiretap evidence and bank audits, Wesley accepted a plea deal, receiving 6 years in a state penitentiary for identity theft and grand larceny. Amber, due to her cooperation and lack of prior record, received 4 years of intensive felony probation, a strict court-ordered financial oversight program, and was completely stripped of her legal status as a beneficiary to the Miller Family Trust. The corporate agent from the Vanguard Group was indicted on federal racketeering charges, forcing the development company to completely abandon their predatory rezoning plans for the quiet suburban cul-de-sac. On a crisp, sunny morning in late January, the red brick colonial house in Philadelphia finally returned to its natural state of peace. The winter sun melted the ice off the ancient oak trees, sending clear water dripping onto the clean gravel driveway. Garrett stood on the front porch, holding a warm mug of black coffee. He had spent the morning completely changing every lock on the heavy oak doors, resetting the security grid, and tidying up the private study. The manila folders, the fraudulent contracts, and the toxic stress of the betrayal had been entirely cleared away. He walked back into the living room, stepping up to the mantelpiece. He picked up the framed photograph of Eleanor, using a clean cloth to gently wipe a speck of dust from the glass. Her smile looked warmer today, as if the very air in the house had been purified of the greed that had threatened to suffocate it. "The house is secure, Eleanor," Garrett whispered, his voice soft but carrying a deep, unshakable strength. "Our legacy is safe." He set the frame back down in the center of the mantel, took a slow sip of his coffee, and looked out the window. The neighborhood was quiet, the wind was calm, and for the first time in months, the retired captain felt a profound, beautiful sense of tranquility settle into his bones. The structure had taken a brutal hit, the predators had breached the gates, but the foundation